All right, so are you ready to explore some uncharted political territory?
I'm ready. Let's dive in.
Okay, great. Because today we're going beyond the familiar territory of Democrats and Republicans.
Sounds intriguing.
We're doing a deep dive into two parties that don't always get the spotlight, the Libertarians and the Greens.
The often overlooked players in the political landscape.
Exactly. And we've got some really interesting material to work with this time around.
Oh, like what?
Well, our main source is this vice presidential candidate forum hosted by Talks Over Drinks.
Interesting.
Yeah, it features Mike Termott, the Libertarian VP candidate, and Tom Georger, co-chair of the Green Party of Virginia.
A chance to hear directly from the source.
Right, and we also get insights from Jim Turney, who's a former Libertarian candidate.
Oh, he's actually run for office.
He has, and won, which I think is going to give us a really unique perspective on how these parties function in the real world, beyond just, the talking points.
Absolutely. It's one thing to have a platform. It's another to actually put it into practice.
Totally. So let's start with the Libertarians.
Right.
Now, the Libertarian Party, they're all about individual liberty, limited government. You could say they're skeptical of centralized power in just about every area.
They're the ultimate champions of keeping the government out of your business.
Exactly. And this skepticism, it influences everything they stand for, from taxes to, you guessed it, foreign policy.
Makes sense. It's like a thread running through all their beliefs.
So, take their stance on the Federal Reserve, for example.
Okay.
They see the Fed as this big, powerful entity that often does more harm than good.
How so?
Well, they argue that the Fed's control of the money supply and government spending are actually the root causes of inflation.
Interesting. It's a perspective you don't always hear in mainstream discussions about economics.
Right, and this skepticism of government overreach extends to other areas too, like the war on drugs.
No, that's one where the libertarians have always had strong opinions.
For sure, and I think Mike Termott, the VP candidate, really embodies that. Well, he used to be a police officer, and he talks about how the war on drugs, from his perspective, often leads to the erosion of individual liberties without actually solving the drug problem.
That's a really powerful perspective, especially coming from someone with firsthand experience.
Totally. And, that hands-off approach that we see with the war on drugs, it also applies to their views on foreign policy, both for Termott and Jim Turney.
So they're not fans of interventionism.
Not at all, especially when it comes to those forever wars in places like the Middle East.
They'd argue that those interventions are costly, both in terms of money and lives.
Absolutely. And they see it as a drain on our freedoms, too.
So what's the alternative? What do they propose instead?
Well, they'd much rather see those resources, that money, invested here at home in things like education, infrastructure, things that directly benefit Americans.
It's about prioritizing domestic needs over foreign entanglements.
Exactly. And this ties into their critique of the military-industrial complex, which they believe has way too much influence over our politicians.
Yeah, a classic case of special interests driving policy decisions.
Right. And their argument is that this complex creates a system where politicians are basically incentivized to keep wars going, even when it might not be in the best interest of the American people.
So there's this disconnect between what's good for the military-industrial complex and what's good for everyday citizens.
That's what they're suggesting, and it raises some really uncomfortable questions about who's really in control.
It definitely challenges the narrative of a government that serves its people above all else.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
So during the forum, Termott throws out this thought experiment.
Oh, I love a good thought experiment. What's it about?
He asks, what would happen if a politician just decided to tell the unvarnished truth, no holds barred?
About what?
Well, he specifically mentions the flaws in the peace through strength doctrine.
The idea that military might equals peace and stability.
Right, and Termott seems to be suggesting that maybe it's actually the other way around, that projecting strength might actually provoke more conflict.
Now that's a thought-provoking idea. What if, instead of trying to achieve peace through military dominance, we explored other avenues?
It's definitely a different way of thinking about foreign policy, and it makes you wonder, what would happen if we actually tried it?
Right. What if we shifted our focus from military intervention to diplomacy, to addressing the root causes of conflict, like poverty and inequality?
It's a question worth pondering, that's for sure.
It certainly challenges the status quo.
It does, and it speaks to this broader question of how much truth we're willing to hear from our leaders.
Because sometimes the truth can be uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
It can challenge our assumptions and force us to confront difficult realities.
And on that note, maybe it's time to shift gears and see what the Green Party has to say about all this.
All right, let's see what perspectives they bring to the table.
So the Green Party,
Yeah.
they're coming at this from a very different angle.
How
Well, their whole philosophy is built around this idea of interconnectedness.
interconnectedness, huh?
Yeah, the idea that, like, we're all in this together, right? That we can't just focus on one issue in isolation.
So it's not just about the environment for them.
It is, but it's bigger than that. They see environmentalism, social justice, peace, all is intertwined.
It's a more holistic view.
Exactly. And this leads them to some pretty ambitious policy goals, like the Green New Deal, for instance.
Ah, the Green New Deal. That's one that's been getting a lot of attention lately.
It has, and Tom Jorger, the Green Party co-chair we heard from earlier,
Yeah.
he really emphasized their commitment to tackling climate change.
Okay.
They see the Green New Deal as a way to create jobs, invest in renewable energy, basically build a more sustainable future.
Ambitious goals, for sure.
They are, but they don't stop there.
What else?
Oh, they're also big proponents of single-payer healthcare and free higher education.
So a much larger role for the government in providing social services.
You could say that, but at the same time, they're also really focused on empowering local communities.
Interesting. So it's a balancing act between those bigger systemic changes and more localized action,
Exactly. They talk a lot about strengthening local economies, promoting sustainable agriculture.
giving people more control over their own lives.
Right. It's all connected.
Now, I remember you mentioned there was this interesting conversation about gun control during the forum.
Oh, yeah, that got a little spicy.
Oh, so.
Well, there was this guy, Jeff Klebb, who described himself as a quote-unquote gun guy.
Okay.
And he really pushed back against some of the common rhetoric around guns.
Like what?
Well, he took issue with phrases like gun show loophole and high-capacity magazines, which he felt were misleading and, kind of used to demonize gun owners.
It's true that language can be really loaded in these debates.
Totally. But what was interesting was how Tom Jorger, the Green Party guy, responded.
What did he say?
He was really measured about it. He emphasized that the Green Party is not about taking away people's guns. They're for common sense safety measures, reasonable regulations.
They're not outright bans.
Exactly. And he even pointed out that there's a diversity of opinion on this issue within the Green Party itself.
Which makes it, no group is a monolith, right?
Totally. Now, there was this other interesting moment where Markle Prines, one of the hosts of Talks Over Drinks,
Yeah.
he posed this question to both the Libertarian and Green candidates.
What was it?
He asked, how would you restore faith in leadership?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Right. Especially these days when it seems like trust in government is at an all-time low.
For sure. So how did they respond?
Well, Joe Bajer, the Green Party candidate, he stressed the need for a more honest and consistent foreign policy.
Interesting.
He talked about ending the forever wars,
Mm.
holding all countries accountable to the same rules, no more double standards.
So for him, it's about restoring America's moral standing in the world.
Exactly. Yeah, so for the libertarians,
Okay.
it all comes back to that idea of limited government,
Right.
less government, less opportunity for corruption, less influence from those special interests.
It's a pretty direct line of thinking.
It is, and they see this connection between, like, domestic policy and foreign policy, right?
How so?
Well, they argue that all that military spending, those endless wars,
Yeah.
it creates a system where politicians are benefiting, but maybe not the average American.
They're not the ones on the front lines, literally or figuratively.
Exactly. So for the libertarians, restoring trust in government, it's not just about electing, like, a good guy or a good gal. It's about fundamentally changing how the system works.
That's a pretty radical idea, isn't it, to really rethink the role of government that drastically?
It is, but that's what makes exploring these alternative perspectives so interesting, right?
It definitely shakes things up.
It makes you think, what if we did try something different? What if we did have a system where the government took a step back and individuals had more freedom?
It's a thought-provoking idea.
It is, and it kind of reminds me of that moment we were talking about earlier with Termont's thought experiment.
Oh, you mean the one about politicians telling the truth?
That's the one. He was talking about the peace through strength doctrine and how maybe it doesn't always work the way we think it does.
A little dose of honesty in politics, imagine that.
Right. But it makes you wonder, why don't we hear more of that? Why don't politicians tell us the straight truth more often?
Is it because they don't think we can handle it?
Or maybe the system's just not set up to reward that kind of honesty.
This is like this vicious cycle.
It is.
We don't trust our leaders, but the system makes it hard for them to be trustworthy.
It's tough nut to crack, that's for sure.
It is, but I think that's why conversations like this are so important.
Totally. Getting these different perspectives out there,
Challenging our assumptions.
it's all part of the process, right?
It is, and even if you don't agree with everything we've talked about today,
Right.
I hope it's at least given you some new ways of thinking about these issues.
I think that's the goal, right? To expand our understanding.
Exactly. Because, the more tools we have in our toolbox,
Love that analogy.
the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of, well, everything.
Absolutely. And, the world of politics, it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area.
A lot of nuance.
And I think these third-party perspectives,
Right.
they help us see those nuances more clearly.
They challenge us to look beyond the usual talking point.
They force us to ask tougher questions.
And maybe, just maybe, come up with some more creative solutions.
That's what I'm hoping for. So to our listeners, next time you're feeling stuck in that two-party rut,
Yeah.
remember what we've talked about today.
There's a whole world of political thought out there.
Don't be afraid to explore it. Seek out those diverse viewpoints. And never stop asking those what-if questions.
Because you might be surprised by what you discover.
Exactly. And on that note,
On that note.
that's a wrap on another thought-provoking deep dive into the world of politics.